The colder things are, the more likely it's to
and warmer things toward colder things. Yes. So it's just a cycle of heat.
Yeah. I just thought the ice was heavy and it just sunk.
To create a culture of argumentation, we need to both create a safe space for students to take risks and also to step back as a teacher and let students take the lead in the conversation. To build a culture of argumentation really does take some time. They're engaging in discussion of questions where it's a real question that they're wondering about, and they're having to use their evidence to convince one another, having to support their claims. And the more it's a regular practice in the class, that helps build that culture. The expectation that it's okay to be wrong or okay to change your mind later, or it's okay not to be sure about your answer and still present your ideas.
Is that the blue balloon is filled with hot water? I think at some point my evidence is it floated in the water because warm water is less dense.
Yeah.
I also heard people disagreeing. I heard some over in this group here. I had some disagreement, and there was a great sort of scientific culture of argumentation happening here. I heard someone saying, "Oh no, that's not. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt." And that's so great. That's like just how a scientist might behave. I think often students have gotten the idea that there is a right answer, and their job is to fish around and produce that right answer. So it's a bit of a change often for some students to be in a situation where there may not be an established right answer, or where the process of getting to the right answer is expected to be messy and we're expected to disagree along the way.
I have a question about what Zach said about the altitude. If there was more, if the research station and it was the altitude affecting it, the dryness, wouldn't the altitude mean more condensation?
Not if it was drier, because it's being closer to the sun, especially if the clouds are below it, then it would only be raining below it, not above it. It's like if you're in space, there's not going to be any rain because you're above the clouds.
To create a culture of argumentation, it really requires the teacher stepping back and the students being in charge of the discussion. It can be really challenging as a teacher to step back and let the students take control. I have a few tricks I use to help get myself out of the way. One is just to physically move around the room. Another, sometimes I'll take notes. That keeps me busy. I'm taking notes instead of responding verbally to students. Or sometimes I'll put myself in charge of operating the projections and projecting what students need to see. All of those help me get out of the way and let students have the conversations.
And it can either turn into ice or will go down since it's more dense with sink because it's heavier.
I want my students to have the feeling that the reason they're having the argument is really to talk to one another, to get their ideas clear with one another, to help one another understand, help themselves understand, and it's not to impress me. And I think if I'm always visiting a group and always checking in, even if I'm not saying anything evaluative as I'm visiting them, kids take that as a little bit like, oh, he wants to see if we're doing the right thing, he wants to check if I'm right. So they're so used to that with teachers. So I think it's occasionally not checking in on anyone sort of sends a message of like, hey, this is important time, even not just because I can hear you, but because you can hear each other.
Because with that experiment, there was like hot water and then cold water, and then the cold moved to where the hot was, and then the hot moved to where the cold was, until it was like all warm.
All the same temperature.
Thank you.
I thought that the reason was because like the colder it is, the denser it is. So then the hot water rises. So then the cold one has to move in to take its place.
That's true. And then also it like spreads out because the cold is like closer together, the molecules, and then the hot is like more spread out.
The colder wants to be with the warm, and the warm wants to cool down.
Exactly.
Finish up your last comment.
I think exactly what it was.
Look up.
Although I didn't think that they want to go warmer or colder.
Thanks, Eva.
So when a student asks me a question directly, my first instinct is just to answer it or to point them to evidence that I want them to consider. So I've developed sort of a question I ask myself, to stop myself, to say, well, do I need to answer this question? Or can another student answer this question? Or can the student answer this question for themselves by going back to the evidence or rethinking their reasoning?
Since people say there's global warming, isn't it true that it's also melting the ice from the North Pole?
Oh, excellent question. Does anyone want to sort of connect to that? If ice is melting at the North Pole, what would that do to the water? What would you predict about the currents?
Nicholas.
Well, I would think that if the poles are melting, the water levels would rise.
Having an argumentation focus has changed the way I think about myself as a teacher. Instead of someone providing information, I'm the facilitator of discovery.
It's like sometimes you can be right and sometimes you don't be right.
I like doing the discussion, and I think it was easy. It was an easier environment to like be able to disagree with somebody or agree with them.
To start creating a culture of argumentation. If we want the argumentation to be student-driven, remove the focus on right and wrong from the classroom, step back to allow students to drive argumentation, and redirect students to their peers.